Refugee women have been historically depicted as vulnerable passive victims who do not have any agency as burdens on host societies. This narrative is frequently weaponized by the populist movements, including the far right, not only in the UK and wider Europe, but all around the world. So in my book, Deconstructing Refugee Women's Empowerment, a comparative approach to British and French aid structures, I investigate how actors in multiple sectors, including humanitarian, asylum, and civil society, attempted, at least on a discursive level, to revise or move beyond, replace dominant vulnerability narratives with policies that support refugee women's empowerment. This attempt is about finding a way or asking if it's possible to decenter state actors and recenter women's lived experiences, their political agency, their authentic or accurate representation in policymaking, for supporting their full integration and inclusion into the societies. Unfortunately, no need to say that these efforts have largely failed, and empowerment lost its political character and reduced to a technocratic policy goal. Today, the space for refugee women's agency is even more narrowing as the UK government's new plan to change the resettlement rules further restricts women's ability to use their skills and experiences to contribute to the public life effectively in the UK. The empowering of women refugees within mainstream assistance networks and frameworks is about saving them from assumed vulnerabilities that are located a priori in non-Western societies. And this means that women are assumed as victims or to be victims because they are non-Western. And this ignores how hostile asylum systems actively produce and sustain those vulnerabilities in the first place. The only way to access assistance is to appear as a defenseless woman who is in need of compassion from the humanitarians, from the host populations. So it is not about them, but it becomes something about the benevolence of the external actors. It becomes about the humanitarians. It becomes about the society itself. And it becomes about legibility and performance and something above politics. And it is stripped from its roots about in solidarity and reciprocity identified and found in Black feminist thought. So, as a researcher, my question was: is it possible to reconcile or reimagine or recover women's empowerment as a political project? And if it's possible to reclaim and reimagine it with emancipation and social justice at its core. And then this curiosity led me to grassroots women-led refugee and migrant organizations in the UK and France. These organizations create spaces and communities that prioritize care, healing, and mutual support, compensating for the lack of public resources and the broader political will. They employ subversive humanitarian strategies to develop bottom-up approaches to women's empowerment, seeking to foster both individual and collective agency. And in doing so, they offer targeted programs such as public speaking workshops, formal advocacy trainings, artistic activities, which allow women to articulate their lived experiences with the general public, to practice politics and to practice politics without being dependent on professional experts in the sector. And these practices reshape how we understand citizenship. So citizenship is maybe not only a legal status, but it is something that is enacted and exercised through, action and participation into the public every day. And this has urgent contemporary relevance as the direct participation of women, queers, and migrants in societies is increasingly targeted and restricted amid this global backlash against diversity and inclusion. Gender, race, and immigration status are weaponized as mechanisms of exclusion, preventing individuals from accessing public spaces and debates. So the book draws on extensive ethnographic fieldwork in refugee organizations that I focus in my research. I conducted semi-structured interviews with humanitarians, frontline workers, refugee and asylum-seeking women themselves, and also advocates and activists. I also engaged in participant observation by volunteering in these organizations that I focus in my book. And this was not only a methodological choice, but it was also an ethical commitment that enabled me to offer my physical labor alongside my alliance and my solidarity to the communities that I worked with. And I use the umbrella term refugee in the book to refer to all women in the study, regardless of whether they have been granted legal protection or not by the British and French states. And my intention here is not to devalue or disregard the particular vulnerabilities that asylum seekers experience compared to legally recognized internationally displaced persons, namely refugees. But instead, my intention was to draw attention to the problematic state-centric nature of the current hostile asylum regimes and the newly invented terminology that reduces human beings into legal categories of deservingness, such as bogus or authentic refugees. Refugee women I worked with in the UK engage in advocacy across a wide range of issues, including campaigns to close down detention centers, ending gender-based violence and destitution, advocating for voting and employment rights, and calling for family reunification. The organizations that I focused support women's advocacy, their political agency, their representation through engaging in subversive humanitarianism, which means that they use these informal community spaces that were initially created for service provision or accessing resources to support and facilitate political action. For example, many organizations that I focus run public speaking programs, and these programs exist in part because refugee women are often misunderstood or disbelieved by both the Home Office, the government, the media, the wider public. And because they are constantly framed as passive, vulnerable victims, they are not given any space to communicate their issues to policymakers, but again, also different actors in the public sphere. And they are forced to rely on, again, professional experts in the sector to communicate their needs and concerns. Even when they do speak, or even when they're given space, their credibility is frequently questioned, because the culture of disbelief embedded in the UK or Home Office's asylum governance casts them as, bogus from the the outset, so they're not believed. In these programs, women learn how to make eye contact, how to use their voice effectively, and a bunch of other different tactics to deliver effective speeches at public events, political rallies, and how to engage in storytelling with a political purpose. They build confidence and autonomy and begin to reclaim control over how their identities, stories, and bodies, most importantly, are perceived in public. This embodied practice is transformative because for many women, it contributes to healing from gender-based violence that they experience at different stages of their journeys. That means before, during, and after their journeys to the UK. And this reclaimed, embodied visibility in the public sphere entails political agency. Women appear as political actors rather than passive beneficiaries of aid, and they start to exercise representation or representational power on their own terms. One of the women that I worked with explained it in the following way. My activism is about speaking out. If we don't tell our stories, no one will, because we are the ones living this reality. When locals speak for us, I find it extremely frustrating because they don't have a clue of what we're going through. Another woman that I work with put it even more directly. You don't have to represent us. Just hand us the mic. Give voice to the voiceless. Why are privileged women like Melinda Gates talking about or sharing my experiences? They are my lived experiences. So both of these powerful quotes show that when women speak out, they're not only sharing their stories, but they're reclaiming authority over these stories and their experiences. Therefore, speaking out is a demand for power, recognition, legitimacy. Organizations also support women's political authorship and visibility through drama, poetry, and choir groups. And these creative activities or spaces directly inform their advocacy efforts because sometimes they perform at public events or special occasions such as the International Women's Day. And in these groups or spaces, art becomes a site of political and emotional transformation, a space where violence, destitution, and homelessness are confronted publicly, and what was once a source of shame or stigma is now transformed into power and visibility. Again, as one woman that I worked with in my research explained it in the following way. Not everyone is comfortable with speaking or hearing about rape, trauma, or violence. Art makes it easier. On stage, we turn pain into peace, love, and hope. Through music and poetry, we show that we are strong and still hopeful about the future, despite everything we have faced so far. So this is again another powerful quote that shows us how art allows women to reframe pain and suffering as political agency. Women that I worked with also utilize international movements and also crisis moments, global crisis moments, to expand and support their agency that is reclaimed in these community spaces. For example, they actively supported the Black Lives Matter protests by using online platforms and publishing blog posts to share how they experience racism in the UK. And the other example that I talk about in the book is the COVID-19 pandemic. During the lockdowns, women again wrote blog posts to document their particular experiences. They also met with MPs on Zooms, which then they later posted the recordings of these meetings to their social media accounts. And in doing so, again, they turned this like crisis moment into an opportunity to practice or exercise politics. This brings us to the central contribution of the book. Empowerment and vulnerability coexist. They're not binaries to each other. They're not mutually exclusive. Refugee women are not either vulnerable or agentic. They are both at the same time. They're both at once at the same time, just like anyone else. And vulnerability does not lie in refugeehood itself, but in the intersection of multiple systems of power and oppression and the hostile asylum systems that hinder women's participation in political life in the first place. And I argue that seeking asylum itself is an act of agency, one that draws on financial, emotional, social, and linguistic resources that many take for granted. And ignoring this is not just a failure of justice, but it is a missed opportunity for host societies to imagine a future rooted in inclusion, equality, and dignity, a future of transformative change. I want to end with a conversation that I had with a refugee woman from Malawi who spent years as an asylum activist in the UK. Once I asked her if she felt her activism was visible enough to the public, and she replied, "You know what? I'm so tired of constantly having to prove myself. It's not my job to teach others how to be ethical human beings. That's their responsibility. If they want to understand the systemic injustices we face every day, we're right here." So her words stay with me as a reminder. Being ethical is not an act of charity, it's a duty. It means refusing ignorance, rejecting indifference, and choosing to pay attention to the realities of others around us. Thank you.